Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Venezuela war breaking news update. I'm just having my first cup of tea of the day. I am behind on everything due to the fact that the US has gone to war with Venezuela. And this is insanely controversial for a number of reasons, and it can have huge ramifications across the world of global geopolitics, not least because it appears to justify what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So there are loads of elements to this that some people might think are good, depending on what your position is on imperialism and the United States having access to huge oil reserves. If you think, hey, that's cool and that this is justified, then this is all fine. If you are wanting to uphold the international rules-based order, and if you want to uphold the Constitution in the United States and international law, then this is terrible. And if you want to see justification for the war in Ukraine from Russia's point of view, then the United States is giving Russia and China, vis-a-vis the invasion of Taiwan, justification for doing so. So this is highly controversial, no matter what you think about Maduro or the regime in Venezuela. You know, you can be the sort of person like myself who thinks Maduro sucks and a Venezuelan regime sucks, but think this is all a bit of a terrible idea. Okay, let's have a look at some of the details. And by the way, it's all coming in thick and fast, but Trump himself has claimed that Maduro has already been captured with his wife and flown out of Venezuela, which, you know, you might also look at this and say, this has been an incredibly successful military operation. There appears to be no resistance in terms of air defenses. What's gone on there? Is that a case of having inside help, or did they just take the Venezuelans by complete surprise? There are claims that since the Venezuelans accepted a Chinese delegation, the Chinese envoy, just hours before this took place, there are claims that the Chinese warned the Venezuelans that they were about to be attacked due to having seen their own satellite imagery, so on and so forth. So all sorts of rumors going on about this. Let's look at some of the details here. I mean, there are so many images, as you can well imagine, coming out. So lots of explosions going on around, particularly Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. Reuters reports that US ground forces and US Air Force assets are currently on the ground and active in and around Caracas, Venezuela. Multiple explosions have been reported and observed across the capital as operations continue, and that was several hours ago. So arguably, it's all happened already. It's been and done, and the US might well have achieved their objectives already, and there won't be some extended period of actual war. We shall see, I guess. Only a year after losing Syria, it's highly likely that Putin will now lose both Venezuela and Iran in the same month, says Jay in Kiev, although he's been very critical of this general activity. There are, we'll talk about this a little bit later, there are potential positives for Ukraine and potential negatives for Ukraine. But yeah, explosions going on all around Caracas. The United States appears to be bombing Venezuela. Massive airstrikes are underway. War is here, says one. OSINT Defender says full-scale military operations appear to be underway against Venezuela. Dozens of helicopters in the US Army spotted over the capital of Caracas. And this is quite incredible footage. Given that, I know I'm going to turn the sound off, but given that you would expect air defense to be incredibly active, especially since they spent an awful lot of money on Russian air defenses, and we don't appear to see any of them active. They've got Chinooks just flying around, you know, the two rotor-bladed helicopters, transport helicopters, don't really have much armament on them. They're flying around Caracas, which tells you that there's just no air defense going on there. Now, did the Americans strategically and with great precision strike all the air defense assets around Caracas? I don't know. Footage of a US helicopter, possibly an AH-1Z Viper, engaging ground targets with gun and rocket fire in Caracas here. So it looks like the Americans have just got free reign over the airspace of Caracas. At this moment, the military and naval infrastructure of Caracas is being massively bombed by the US Navy fleets, cruise missiles and glide bombs, Tomahawks, etc. So yeah, lots of, I think, port infrastructure being taken out there potentially, or maybe air defense near the ports. Here we have Oliver Alexander saying Trump starting a war in order to show people that he deserved the Nobel Peace Prize instead of Maria Corina Machado is very on brand. That's something that we will return to. Quite incredible. And then this is that same footage from earlier, but I think possibly a little bit closer, maybe the exactly same footage. Massive explosion earlier at Higuerote Airport in the state of Miranda, northern Venezuela, so somewhere else, with secondary explosions and fire suggesting a strike against the surface-to-air missile launcher with the Venezuelan Air Force. So that could be your suppression or destruction of enemy air defenses, exactly what you would want to be doing prior to any major interaction there. Here we have another video showing a military helicopter firing rockets at a ground target in Caracas. This could be that same helicopter from a different angle here. So an awful lot going on, as you can imagine. And then just finally for this section of things blowing up, Justin, the entire US Air Force has disabled virtually all flight tracking transponders, according to Flight Radar 24. So that's pretty, I think, distinct evidence that the Americans are up to something pretty large scale there. Now, okay, let's talk about political, implications, but first, actually, political justification or lack of justification. So there are several things that are going on here. One is rank hypocrisy from Donald Trump and his regime, because he has stated during his election campaign that he was a president or would be the president of peace. And he's doing anything but peace here. He's also acting against the Constitution. He's also acting against international law. And he's also providing justification for other nations to invade for imperialistic reasons. And we're going to talk about the reason why the US is doing what it's doing in a while. But let's first go to Harry Sisson here saying CBS just confirmed that Donald Trump ordered military strikes against Venezuela early this morning. The capital city of Caracas has been struck with a number of locations on fire. Trump, the guy who said no more war, just got us into a war. And indeed, let's just also remind you that the Chinese special envoy was in Caracas earlier, as I previously mentioned, just hours before the attacks begun. There were claims that the Venezuelan Minister of Defense, Pedro Lopez, has been killed in Caracas, but he's also been seen on camera saying that they will resist. So there are contradictory claims confirming this information, as N-Strike here says, this information has not yet been officially confirmed, and there is a contradiction to that, but that may have happened. And here indeed is the defense minister alive and releasing a video message calling for anti-imperialist and liberation war against the American empire. And then we heard claims that Maduro and indeed his wife had been captured by the US forces already in Venezuela. This was confirmed by Trump himself, and he confirmed he was behind the strike. So he said the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. The operation was done in conjunction with US law enforcement. Of course, US law has no jurisdiction in Venezuela. Details to follow. There will be a news conference today at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So, okay, an awful lot has potentially happened and happened very quickly. If we go back to Donald Trump, I just want to play you a little bit of Donald Trump himself. He should be hoisted by his own petard.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. How
So he has previously talked about, if Venezuela had collapsed, we would have got all that oil. And here he is speaking to News Nation.
Just a blockade. We're not going to let anybody going through that shouldn't be going through. You remember they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil from not that long ago, and we want it back. But they took it. They illegally took it.
So this appears to be the justification, the entire justification for the war. Remember previously the striking of the boats, the supposed drug smuggling boats around Venezuela. This was initially about drug smuggling and treating these drug smugglers and these cartels as enemies of the state, as terrorist organizations, and that these people were conducting war against the United States by killing American citizens through their drug trade, when of course most of the drugs from Venezuela do not go to the United States. United States has more of a problem with drugs coming from Colombia and through Mexico, but not from Venezuela. Then we've just seen of these boats being blown up, war crimes taking place, shipwrecked sailors, if you like, being hit by subsequent missiles. And we saw weed floating ashore, as in marijuana. And Venezuelan marijuana doesn't go to the United States. So if they were drug boats, they had the wrong drugs, and they were apparently going eastwards, not westwards, and so on and so forth. So that was all controversial. But really, and this is exactly what I said at the time, this was just a precursor to war. This was an excuse for going to war with Venezuela so that they could help themselves to the oil. There was nothing else other than the oil that they were interested in. Drug smuggling was a complete it was an attempt to hoodwink the world, really, in terms of what their real intentions were vis-a-vis Venezuela. They wanted the oil, and Trump has told you that. You've had people like Representative Salazar on TV saying, yep, our oil companies in the US are going to make an absolute mint out of war with Venezuela. So increasingly, even though these drug boats were being struck, increasingly people were talking in terms of oil and imperialism. And that is indeed what has happened, in my opinion. So here we have Niles Stanage saying, to believe this is about drug smuggling, you have to ignore Trump's pardon of the former Honduran president for drug smuggling. To believe it's about Maduro's democratic legitimacy, you had to believe Trump cares about even slightly about democratic legitimacy, which he doesn't. Alternatively, it's about crude oil reserves and exports and whatnot. Venezuela has huge crude oil reserves. And by the way, so does the neighboring Guyana. Well, I'd be pretty nervous there as well. But of course, their exports have been hit. Venezuelan exports have been hit. Now, it's interesting to look at. We're going to come to the US justification for this a little bit later, in terms of what both Trump and Stephen Miller have said with regard to Venezuela supposedly illegally stealing American oil and assets, which is essentially not correct. But first of all, Gunter Eagleman, one of these massive supporters of Trump online and MAGA and America First, no new wars. And Donald Trump saying previously, back in 2025 in June, congratulations, world, it's time for peace. People now saying, yeah, congratulations, world, you've gone to war in Venezuela. Here we have Trump with his own words.
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars. No,
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars. No more wars. No more disruptions. We will have prosperity and we will have peace. Under Trump, we will have no more wars, no more disruptions, and we will have prosperity and peace for all. I am the candidate of peace. I am peace. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
So at the very least, you have Trump being hypocritical and having double standards, right? At the very least, even if you agree that there is great justification for this war, for this attack on Venezuela, Trump has been lying to you, because Venezuela hasn't changed its ways at all, right? Trump knew this before he came into power, and he's known it for the last year. So when he stood there and said there will be no more wars, he is lying, or he's changed his mind. But that's fairly disingenuous, because there's no new data that justifies that. Anyway, Tatragami here, quite correctly calling him out on the Nobel Peace Prize demands. Someone call Oslo. This man just earned himself a Nobel Peace Prize. Very obviously sarcastic there. Now, even Fox News are calling him out on his claims of being a man of peace.
But again, we did not hear from President Trump today. We have not heard from him since New Year's Eve. But it is notable, again, that the president was talking about wanting peace. And last year, Chanley, the U.S. struck 7 different countries around the world. That does not include the dozens of strikes in the Caribbean, Eastern Pacific against those alleged drug boats. And we've been seeing this build up. And once these buildups happen, very rarely do they stand down. And we haven't seen any reports of U.S. military forces going home. We've seen a few flights return, but again, there's been this daily ramp up to this moment in time. But again,
so the idea here is that Fox News claiming that, hang on, not even if we discount the strikes on the boats off Venezuela and in the Caribbean, the US has struck 7 countries over the last year. So the idea that you got a president of peace here is just ostensibly BS. Derek Grossman here saying, I never want to hear American presidents lecture the world about the rules-based international order again. And here's your problem, is that essentially Donald Trump is giving permission to China to attack Taiwan and Russia to attack Ukraine and any other country to attack any other country if they want to help themselves to oil. If you want to be imperialistic, this is justification for imperialism. This is a precedent for bigger countries attacking smaller countries to help themselves to their natural resources, whether you like those countries' leaders or not, or their political systems or not. You know, this is going against a rules-based order. So I don't like Maduro. The Venezuelan government sucks, right? But this is just advocacy for open war on anyone who has stuff that you want. This is essentially justification for burglary, internationally speaking. So the Constitution is explicit. Only Congress has the power to declare war. When a president bypasses that authority, it is not leadership or strength. It is a direct assault on the rule of law and democratic accountability. This is an impeachable offense. Now, there are, I think, ways that you can get around this. I think there's that 60-day rule and whatnot. But this is really controversial with regard to the Constitution. Indeed, the Senate Armed Services Committee was not notified ahead of any potential military action taken tonight in Venezuela, a source familiar says. So there was no recourse to communicating with Congress at all, and with the particular committees within Congress that should be notified of such action. It just this is really pretty unprecedented. Now, Ioni Escola, I think, reflects my views on this. I have zero sympathy, he says, for Maduro and his regime, but there is no legitimacy in Trump deciding to bomb Venezuela. It's pure imperialism, which gives imperialists in Russia and China an excuse to use whataboutism to justify their own insane actions. That, if you're going to sum up this entire incident or war right now, it's those 2 sentences. That is entirely what I believe, and I will repeat it for you. I have zero sympathy for Maduro and his regime, but there is no legitimacy in Trump deciding to bomb Venezuela. It's pure imperialism, which gives imperialists in Russia and China an excuse to use whataboutism to justify their own insane actions. There. Michael McFaul, the previous ambassador or a former ambassador to Russia, says in answer to US President Trump ordering strikes on Venezuela, why? What US interest is being advanced by this war? We American citizens are owed an explanation. That's how it works in a democracy. That's how it's written in the US Constitution. Now, what is the justification then? So we have heard Trump and people like Stephen Miller talk about Venezuelan oil being American oil and being stolen, and it was expropriated, etc., etc. There's an explainer here in Al Jazeera, which is actually a really useful article. So Stephen Miller, like Trump, has said American sweat, ingenuity, and toil created the oil industry in Venezuela. Its tyrannical expropriation was the largest recorded theft of American wealth and property. These pillaged assets were then used to fund terrorism and flood our streets with killers, mercenaries, and drugs. And then there's also Donald Trump saying Venezuela is completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. It will only get bigger, and the shock to them will be like nothing they've ever seen before until such time as they return to the United States of America all the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole from us. The illegitimate Maduro regime is using oil from those stolen oil fields to finance themselves, so on and so forth, right? So it's very clear from the president and the other president, Stephen Miller, that they believe that the Venezuelans have stolen stuff off the United States, and though that includes their own oil reserves that they have sovereign control over, and we'll talk about that in a second, they believe they've stolen that off the United States, and therefore the United States is justified in taking them back. That is incredibly controversial. Venezuela has huge oil reserves in the Orinoco oil belt particularly, but not just there. And that is what the US want to help themselves do. Now, why does the US believe it has a claim to Venezuelan oil? I'm going to read this part to you because it's super freaking important. Because if this falls down, then the United States really has no justification for doing what they've done. And it falls down and they don't have that justification. So, quote, the US claim is best understood as a political argument built from two ingredients: a historical story about US firms' early role in developing Venezuela's petroleum sector, and a legal grievance about Venezuela's past expropriations of foreign oil assets. Salvador Santino Reguilme, a political scientist who leads the international relations program at Leiden University in the Netherlands, told Al Jazeera. Stephen Miller's framing that the US created the oil industry in Venezuela, and therefore Venezuelan oil belongs to the US, is explicitly a rhetorical escalation of that story rather than a standard legal position. In other words, there is no legal basis for what Miller or Trump is claiming. US companies began drilling for oil in Venezuela in the early 1900s. In 1922, vast petroleum reserves were, and this is super freaking important, by the way, this next sentence is key because it undermines everything. And actually, it means that the UK and the Netherlands have the rights to go to war with Venezuela and make claims to those oil, and not the Americans. In 1922, vast petroleum reserves were initially discovered. Who by? By Royal Dutch Shell. So the Shell being the British Dutch oil concern, in Venezuela's Lake Maracaibo in Zulia State, northwestern Venezuela. So admittedly, that is not the Orinoco belt, that is up here. But if that's your claim, then actually the British and Dutch have an earlier claim to Venezuelan oil reserves. At this point, the US ramped up its investment in the extraction and development of Venezuelan oil reserves. Companies such as Standard Oil led development under concession agreements, propelling Venezuela to a position as a key global supplier, especially for the US. Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC, joining its creation on September 14th, 1960. OPEC is a group of major oil exporting countries that work together to manage supply and influence global oil prices. That began to wind up when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976 under then President Carlos Andres Perez. Amid the oil boom, he established the state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, to control all oil resources. Venezuela continued to be a major oil exporter to the US for some years, supplying 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day in the late 1990s and 2000s. But after Hugo Chavez took office in 1998, he nationalized all oil assets, seized foreign-owned assets, restructured PDVSA, and prioritized political goals over exports, leading to declining production alongside mismanagement and underinvestment. So what this then led to was the US sanctioning over time and successive governments Venezuela for doing this, for nationalizing their own oil reserves and the oil industry that that included an awful lot of an American investment and assets in Venezuela. Now, today, PDVSA controls the petroleum industry in Venezuela, and US involvement in Venezuelan oil drilling is limited. Houston-based Chevron is the only US company that still operates in Venezuela. So Chevron, interestingly, has this agreement whereby oil fields are owned by the PDVSA, the nationalized entity, but they are able to drill there, and then that gets around sanctions and gets all oil back to the United States because it's Chevron that does it. But I guess the argument is whether there is any legal basis for the US to demand that oil is theirs, given that their private entities were initially drilling and then it was subsequently nationalized. So is it illegal to nationalize your own sovereign resources? So is there any legal basis to US claims on Venezuelan oil? Simple answer is no. International law is clear that sovereign states own the natural resources within their territories under the principle of permanent sovereignty over national resources, PSNR. This means that sovereign states have the inherent right to control, use, and dispose of their resources for their own development. The concept of PSNR emerged after 1945 during the decolonization of former European colonies. It was solidified by the United Nations General Assembly in a resolution adopted in December 1962. Under this law, therefore, Venezuela owns its oil. It would be illegal under international law for the US to lay claim to it. That is the key here. Quote, a blanket claim of US ownership of Venezuelan oil has no credible basis in international law, said Regilme. The more legally recognizable claim is narrower, namely demands for compensation tied to alleged unlawful expropriation of specific investments, which is the terrain of investment arbitration and enforcement litigation. So there is an option for the US to go down, to take on, which is to try and get reparations from Venezuela for the expropriation of American private assets. But that is not what the US is doing. The US is going in and effectively invading the country, deposing its leader. Goodness knows what happens next, but it is very clear that it's going to help itself to the oil reserves of Venezuela. And that is absolutely just incredible. So I just thought it was important to go through that with you. Now, the other reaction I think is pretty varied, to be honest. So here's Kim.com. Now, Kim.com is this online person who is an egregious human being. It's actually, I think, a Kiwi. But he is a massive supporter of Elon Musk, massive kind of pro-MAGA, pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, all of those sorts of things. You would expect to come out and be really supportive of Trump here, right? His position is this is an unprovoked, unsanctioned war against Venezuela to pirate its oil. It's also the end of Trump, America first, MAGA, and US empire. The end. So why do I bother reading his opinion out? Because actually, sometimes these act as barometers for opinion online. Now, could this be that he wants to be pro-Russian and Venezuela are allies of Russia, and therefore he's kind of siding with Venezuela over that? But then actually you can argue that what the US is doing is giving Russia permission to attack Ukraine. So there are so many different dynamics going on here that you can pick any side and kind of look for some kind of justification, no matter what your core positioning is. Here we have a comment from Ukrainian social media this morning, summing up Kyiv's position on Venezuelan events, or at least that's what Jay and Kyiv says. Who knows whether this is an opinion that is reflected anywhere else in Ukraine, but it's quite interesting to read. Quote, it's funny, of course, how Venezuela, which supports the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is now complaining about a US invasion and asking for help. Well, you yourself previously agreed that it's possible, and if it's possible for us, then it's possible for you too. Sorry. And actually, they've got a point, which is you, Venezuela, like as much as we disagree that you shouldn't be attacked, like from a Ukrainian point of view, like the US attack of Venezuela is terrible because it justifies what Russia is doing to Ukraine. But at the same time, Ukraine have every right to go to Venezuela. Mate, you don't get to complain because you supported Russia doing this to us. So if you supported Russia doing this to us, we have no sympathy for you when you get attacked by the United States. Yes, what the United States is doing is terrible, but you don't get to complain because you supported what's happening to us, and we have been killed en masse by the Russians, and you have justified that. So that's an interesting position there, and I wonder how many Ukrainians would kind of agree with that. And then we have here that someone pointing out that this has involved insider trading and people grifting off this war. A brand new account in Polymarket only invested in US going to war with Venezuela and Maduro out by January the 31st. Up 13,000 so far, with spending thousands on Maduro out at bargain prices as recently as 4 hours ago. Now it's at blah, blah, blah. I don't really understand all that. But the point is that people, possibly with insider information, are betting on the war. It's only existed for a week and quickly became the biggest yes holder in the Maduro out market. Seems pretty suspicious. Pete Hegseth making some beer money on the side. Now that Maduro is out at 0.99 following the Trump announcement, this account has in 1 week realized nearly $150,000 in profit and has hundreds of thousands more in unrealized profits. These betting sites, like the amount of insider trading you can do, is absolutely incredible. Right, so I'm going to go now to just one of the mainstream media outlets to see, what they are reporting and how they are summing it all up. As you can imagine, the main element of the story is that Trump has claimed Maduro has been flown out of the country with his wife. There are lots of pictures coming out. What's going to be interesting is how the international community react to this. Italy's Foreign Minister Tajani said on Saturday that Rome and its diplomatic representation in Caracas were monitoring any developments in the situation in Venezuela with particular attention to the Italian community in the country, but they're not really casting any opinion there. Again, German Foreign Ministry is talking about its crisis team and watching the situation, but no condemnation or anything. Spain here has a longer statement, says Spain calls for de-escalation and moderation and for action to be conducted in accordance with international law and principles of the UN Charter. The inference there, the implication there is that they are not presently acting in accordance with international law and principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, they say Spain is prepared to offer its good offices to achieve a peaceful and negotiated solution to the current crisis. What you will notice, though, is that there's no condemnation of what the US does. And this is the weakness of the international community, or maybe the strength of the American nation, in that we can't criticize the US because we'll end up having tariffs slapped on us, right? So it means that the US gets to do what it wants, bullies the world, invades other countries, and everyone else goes, well, just make sure you do this by international law. Yeah, but they're not doing it by but as long as we say that, that's all right, right? I mean, Spain reiterates that it has not recognized the results of the 28th of July 2024 elections, and that has always supported initiatives to achieve a democratic solution for Venezuela. It also reiterates that it has welcomed and will continue to welcome tens of thousands of Venezuelans who have had to leave their country for political reasons, and that it is prepared to assist in the search for a democratic, negotiated and peaceful solution for the country. But there's no condemnation of what the United States has done. And imagine, compare that to what happened when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and everyone rightfully called out Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine and condemned it straight away. Why is there no condemnation here? Because it's one of our own, right? It's because it's our ally. It's because if we criticize the United States, we are going to pay the consequences ourselves, diplomatically or economically. So Trump has described the attack on Venezuela as a brilliant operation, and it probably was, right? Quote, a lot of good planning and a lot of great troops and great people. It was a brilliant operation, actually. Asked if he had sought congressional authority for the operation and what is next for the South American country, the US president told the New York Times that he would address those questions during his upcoming press conference in Mar-a-Lago, which I guess is a big no. So, yeah, the Venezuelan defense chief has said they have attacked us, but they will not vanquish us. We will form an indestructible wall of resistance. Our vocation is peace, but our heritage is the fight for freedom. I would imagine if the Americans were going to be anywhere near sensible about this, they would depose Maduro and just put in their own kind of pro-American puppet government and just allow the democratic opposition hopefully to get power in Caracas and then kind of squeeze that political operation to advance America's cause with regard to American oil entities being able to help themselves to the Venezuelan oil reserves, rather than forcibly take over those reserves and invade the country in any major way. I mean, that would get the US embroiled in a much longer, more intractable war. If you're going to do anything, just get rid of the government, allow a pro-democratic government to take its place, and then try and get your own way through other means, non-military means. So what we know so far, let's see if there's anything that I've missed. Donald Trump has claimed the US has captured Venezuela's dictator Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores and flown him out of the South American country after a pre-dawn assault on Caracas and the surrounding region. Venezuela's government accused the US of launching a series of attacks against civilian and military targets that rocked its capital. In a statement, Venezuela's government urged citizens to rise up against the assaults and said Washington risked plunging Latin America into chaos with an extremely serious act of military aggression. The entire country must mobilize to defeat the imperialist aggression, it added. Explosions and low-flying aircraft were heard in Caracas in the early hours of Saturday. We saw all of that. Venezuela has accused the US of trying to seize control of the country's resources, in particular its oil and minerals. Country has called on the international community to denounce what it called a flagrant violation of international law that put millions of lives at risk. That's a key to watch out for. What is the international reaction to this? What's the UN going to say? A UN Security Council meeting? Surely there'll be an emergency meeting. The Americans need to have their knuckles wrapped for this, and that is me being understating of the issue here, but they invariably won't, because they essentially are the international bully here. In the early hours of Saturday, President of neighboring Colombia, Gustavo Petro, called for an immediate emergency session of the UN Security Council. There you go. So we'll have to see what happens with regard to that. And then, of course, you've got Iran, as I was reporting on yesterday. So this is where we then start looking at the international implications of all this. What happens now? So if Venezuela falls apart. So, okay, let's look at the good outcomes of this, because it's complicated, right? I definitely do not advocate what the US has done, because it's imperialistic and it justifies wars, etc., etc. But if we're going to look at the silver lining to this cloud, then Venezuela falls apart, and therefore its support for Russia falls apart. And depending on whether they're buying weapons from Russia, sustaining Russia's economy somewhat, or getting oil to or from, or however there is economic support for Russia, that goes, quite possibly. But also their UN support or their political diplomatic support for Russia evaporates as well. And at the same time, Iran is in trouble. And if Iran's support for Russia, and you can talk about, sanctions evasion, military support, buying or swapping of arms and technology, all these ways that Iran supports Russia, and then its own kind of political diplomatic support and UN support for Russia. You have two key supporters of Russia suddenly in trouble here. And that is good for Ukraine, right? So Ukraine benefits from these two countries going in that direction. But on the other hand, this also gives, the US can no longer criticize Russia for invading Ukraine. Honestly, this This is huge. Like any time the US says we are going to help Ukraine because XYZ, Russia can just turn around and say, yeah, but XYZ no longer counts because you've just done exactly the same thing in Venezuela, and Venezuela were our mates. So you've got no leg to stand on there, the US. You are not justified anymore in supporting Ukraine based on those sets of reasons. And then that means that the US is probably less likely to support Ukraine because they have no actual moral political justification for so doing. And then of course, you know, you've got Taiwan thinking, well, this is looking bad, isn't it? You know, China can just say, right now, America has given permission for China to invade Taiwan. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. The United States has invaded Venezuela for its oil. And they've told you that. And so the international law is done away with. International rules-based order, done away with. Constitution, done away with. Recourse to Congress, yeah, whatever. Don't need it. We can just break the rules and invade another country and say we're going to have your oil. And there you go. And that is a really, really dangerous precedent. We are, I think, entering a stage in the world now where you could see a precipitous breakdown of international law and norms. Trump has come along and he's just thrown out moral norms and political norms and mores to the point where you're wondering what the world's going to look like going forward. You know, when you had the invasion into Iraq, yes, we can all argue, and very, I think, successfully, that it was all about the oil in Iraq and having contracts in Iraq and whatever. But actually, you know, it was ostensibly in public about weapons of mass destruction, and you know, it's been controversial ever since. But they could hide behind some kind of pretense of, you know, trying to make sure that this horrible regime didn't have access to horrific weapons that could kill lots of people, etc., etc. But it's really about the oil. Here in Venezuela, like there's no pretense. They tried their whole kind of drug pretense, right? But seemed to just give up on that when it was very clear that there was no legal justification for that. And then it's just like, yeah, no, we want the oil. It's our oil. They nicked it off us, so we're going to nick it back. And that's where we're at. And so I just think that opens the door for everyone else to act in a similar fashion. That is exceptionally dangerous. And that's pretty much where we are. And so I'll probably leave it at that. We'll have to wait to see, as I say, what the international reaction to all of this is likely to be going forward. And just seeing if anything else has, you know, as someone says, the next 72 hours are critical for the world. If the United States succeeds in imposing control over Venezuela, and by extension over the world's largest proven oil reserves, it will mark a major shift in global power. Such a move would not be about restoring democracy or protecting human rights, but about reasserting strategic dominance over energy, trade routes, and regional alignments. I mean, this is just imperialism 101. In that case, Iran would likely move to the forefront of Washington's strategic priorities. Securing control over Venezuelan oil would reduce US vulnerability to energy disruptions in the Gulf and provide a buffer against supply shocks in the event of a confrontation with Iran. With a reliable alternative source of heavy crude under its influence, Washington would be better positioned to absorb or offset the destruction or shutdown of energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf during a war. This would lower the economic cost of escalation and make military pressure against Iran more politically and economically manageable. At the same time, such control would strengthen the United States' ability to shape global oil flows and pricing, reinforcing the central role of the dollar in energy markets and helping preserve the petrodollar system that underpins US financial power. Venezuela would thus become more than a regional issue. It would become a strategic precedent, a demonstration that economic pressure, political engineering, and, if necessary, force can be used to restructure sovereign states and realign the global balance of power. However, if the United States becomes entangled in Venezuela and faces sustained resistance, the outcome shifts dramatically. A prolonged crisis would drain political capital, stretch military and economic resources, and weaken Washington's capacity to project power elsewhere, including in the Middle East. That would also complicate Israeli strategic planning, which is closely tied to the US regional leverage. What happens in Venezuela will not stay in Latin America. It will shape the future of energy control, the limits of American power, and a direction of geopolitical confrontation far beyond Caracas, says Ibrahim Majed. I don't know who that person is, but that is a pretty sound, I think, interpretation of where we're at and where we might go. Just before I leave you, somebody says, fellow Javi says, there are rumors that it is a negotiated exit for Maduro and his wife. So that could be why there was a lack of air defense, that actually, he knew it was going to happen and he got flown out and comes to some agreement where he lives out his life in peace. Who knows? Thank you to Rebel Oiku for the super chat there. Really appreciate that super sticker. Penguin95 says Donald Trump announced via True Social that Maduro and his wife have been captured by US forces and flown out of the country. Yep, that was obviously right at the beginning of the video. Thank you, Penguin, for that support. And who's popping? Operation Epstein distraction commence. And sorry, that is one other thing to mention as well. I can't believe I haven't mentioned that already. Virtually everything you understand as what Trump does and why he does it needs to be seen in the context of distraction away from the Epstein files. The Epstein controversy should be the end of Donald Trump, politically speaking. His position as president of the United States in any other era would have been untenable given the Epstein scandal. But Donald Trump appears to just be like Teflon and just, hey, I'm going to carry on unblinkingly, and just shrugs these scandals off. And when he still has broadly 40% of the population, or late 30% of the population supporting him after all these controversies, then you can kind of understand why he has that confidence. 1 in 3 people, no matter what he does, no matter if he's accused of being a paedophile or not, type thing, will support him. You're like, well, that gives me, how he sees it, free reign to do what I like. But also, if that continues going south, that support for him. So, okay, if his base do start getting even more jittery given the Epstein files scandal, then, that could be a problem. So I need to distract away. The Epstein scandal is his biggest threat, right? So he recognizes that. So everything is about distraction away from the Epstein scandal. And you could argue that Venezuela, this will put the Epstein scandal on the back burner for a long time. This does a very good job of distracting the American public away from his single biggest weakness. So, could he have attacked Venezuela to distract away from the Epstein files scandal? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that is his political survival. So, this is fairly typical. So your anti-Trump narrative doesn't change the fact that he has done a good thing for the people of Venezuela. I'm not being anti-Trump by point of other than I'm anti him because he's anti the rule of law and international rules and norms. Like, do you, Jason Hawke, do you justify do you think it's a good thing that a larger country can invade a smaller country and help itself to their natural resources? Do you think that's acceptable? Do you think it's okay to bomb another country willy-nilly? Like, at what point do you argue that it's better for the population? Imagine that you are a supporter of AfD in Germany. So you are a right-wing populist, right, Jason Hawke? Let's assume you're a right-wing populist and you advocate for AfD. So you think it's better if AfD were in charge of Germany than the present government, than the Friedrich Merz CDU. Okay? So therefore, that justifies Trump bombing Germany because he would have done a good thing for the people of Germany, because you believe that the people of Germany would be better off if AfD were in charge and CDU. So that justifies. At what point is it acceptable to bomb another country and help yourself to their resources? At what point is that acceptable in order to be of benefit to the people of that country? What's your tipping point of where, or it's bad enough for those people that I advocate Americans bombing them? I just want to know, Jason, have you thought this through? Or should we just rely on international law to say you can't do that, and we need to do things through, international legal methods and mechanisms? Because, Jason Hawk, if you're Taiwanese, mate, then you've just justified China invading Taiwan. And the Chinese will say, it's going to be a good thing for the people of Taiwan. As the Russians have said, this is going to be a good thing for the people of Ukraine. So, Jason Hawk, I'm sorry, but this isn't about me being anti-Trump. This is about me being pro-rule of law. And you are advocating moving to a position of... He may be an illegitimate president, but how many illegitimate presidents can you argue there are around the world? China's an illegitimate president. Should we go to war with them? But it's not just that, mate. It's about what Trump talking about, helping himself to Venezuelan oil. Like, you've ignored the justification for this. It's nothing to do with political illegitimacy. And that was one of the arguments I said at the beginning of this video, Jason. If it was about political illegitimacy, he would be arguing for democratic ideals around the world. Do you know who Trump supports? Do you know who he said the most positive things about during the course of his second tenure and first tenure? Dictators. He doesn't give one shit about democratic legitimacy, Jason Hawk. He doesn't care one iota. He loves himself a Jair Bolsonaro. He loves himself a Viktor Orban. He loves himself Vladimir Putin. He loves himself a Kim Jong-un and a Xi Jinping. Do you know who he's slagged off consistently? Democratically elected leaders around the world all the time. So what you are doing is you're trying to post hoc rationalize your support for Trump here. You're trying to say, I love what he's done here because either I love Trump so much or whatever, but so therefore I will justify Trump's actions here, ignoring how he's justified those actions and what this means for international law going forward. So your position, Jason, is completely and utterly untenable here. So, I can't be any clearer than that. Like, I don't like Maduro. I think he's illegitimate, but I don't advocate the UK going in because we were the first to find oil in Venezuela. I don't justify the UK invading Venezuela and helping ourselves to their oil. That is imperialism. Jason Hawk, you are an imperialist, which is fine. Just admit it. Just admit that you don't care for, don't talk to me about democratic legitimacy or illegitimacy when you have the Americans invading another country without democratic justification or permission. So what about your own constitution? What about going to Congress to get democratic justification for doing that action? So that you don't have a single leg to stand on, Jason. No offense, but you need to, I think through your position a little bit more carefully. Goose Springsteen here. Just woken up after a night shift. Seems like the world is radically changing. One of the ancillary arguments is if Taiwan was invaded, China would use missiles in Venezuela to close the Panama Canal. I mean, you can think up all sorts of actions and ramifications that could happen going forward here, Goose. But I think you're quite right in saying the world is radically changing. This is yet another inflection point in the world. And by the way, please don't, if the mods have banned Jason Hawk, please unban him, because I really do appreciate positions that are different from my own. I will argue with them, but please don't shut them down unless they are proper trolls. If they're just people that disagree, please, mods, do not ban people. So unban Jason Hawk if you have taken him out, because that kind of conversation I think is necessary, because that conversation will be going on in the United States and around the world, where people will be trying to justify this from a Trumpian point of view, saying, well, but they'll be looking at all these other arguments that are ancillary arguments that they could try and cobble together to justify what Trump has done. But Trump is just being imperialistic, and he's given you that argument already. Stephen Miller has given you that argument already. So you know, I think it's really important that we have cool. He's not banned. Brilliant. I was just making sure that we have some. That we have some good debate, because I think it, you know, there could be justification for what Trump has done. I can bring up a moral argument that what Trump has done, in exactly like Jason Hawke has done, is correct and is justifiable. And I can talk to you about how this will be better going forward for the Venezuelans in terms of opening up democracy to Venezuela, blah 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 blah. But this involves the US helping themselves to Venezuelan oil, then it starts getting a little bit more controversial. So it's like, you know, I break in, I smash down. This is just pure moral consequentialism. I smash down the windows of my local shop so that I can help myself to all the food on the shelves. But then, you know, I give that food to my children. My children are better off. I don't tell them how I did it. My children are better off because they've got that food. So I could say, well, you know, look, my children, but you know, you can, or I'd give it to homeless people, whatever. It's like, yeah, but now you're just advocating breaking the law in order to do things that are good for these people over there. And so it gets very complicated. And this is, you know, why you have rules of thumb, moral laws, so that you don't have people taking the law into their own hands. Otherwise, we'll all be smashing up shops, nicking the food and giving it to homeless people. Yeah, it's better for them. Yeah, but look, you've just broken the law, and it's just chaos. And now it's a wild west. Now anyone could do what they like, because hey, you're justifying it with some kind of benefit over here that's extrajudicial. As soon as you start doing things that are extrajudicial, you can morally, and this is where you need to do a little bit of philosophy here, which is like, and I keep talking to you about the divergence between morality and legality. So we can make moral arguments for all sorts of things that sit outside the law. It's illegal to do that, but it's morally good to do it. Yeah, but if we did that all the time, then laws would mean nothing, and we'd just enter into a period of chaos, which is kind of where kind of Goose might be right in saying, you know, it seems like the world is radically changing. Yeah, are we moving to a point where rules don't mean anything, and this is a time of international legal chaos? In which case, you know, be warned. Goose, again, I've only just joined the stream, but is there anything that makes this worse than Iraq in your view? Yeah, actually the reasons they've given are much more obvious. I think they're quite aligned, Goose, by the way. So, but as I said earlier, the difference with Iraq is, I said, we're pretending this is about weapons of mass destruction, whereas in Venezuela, they're not pretending anymore. They tried to pretend with the drug stuff, right? But they've given up on that and said, yeah, we just want the oil back. So now, the difference here is the brazenness, which you could argue at least they're being more honest. But I think it makes it much harder to justify legally, and that puts the United States in a more precarious legal situation. But it then also puts foreign nations in a really difficult situation, because by rights, we should all be coming out and condemning the hell out of what the United States has done. But no one wants to do that because they're going to get hit with punishment for the United States. So yeah, it's really difficult. Anyway, that's, yeah, so this is interesting as well. So there's another difference maybe, Goose, and I don't know the stats here, but Iraq had 70% public approval going in. Now it has 30%. The war has 30% going in. So like, this starts off already as being a far, far less popular thing than the Iraq war was contemporaneously. Okay. Yeah, so Kathy's guest here says, Jonathan, this action just removed an illegal, crazy, incompetent leader. Yeah, but who gets to state who's crazy, incompetent, and like, does that justify any nation going in, or should the UN go in? Like, this is vigilantism, right? So the US gets to say that this is a crazy incompetent leader. Okay, I can agree that he's a crazy incompetent leader. The USA cannot steal the Venezuelan oil, but the USA has said that it will do that. I mean, they have told you that. So one way or another, they will steal it, or they will put in a government that will give them preferential access to that oil. And essentially, that is the same as stealing it. They have gone to war, deposed the leader, and put in a leadership that will benefit the United States. So this is imperialism. And again, you might think it's morally acceptable to get rid of that leader, but what you're doing is that's at the cost of breaking the international rules-based order. That is a cost of justifying the attack of Russia and the attack of Taiwan. So it's just really dangerous. So just be careful. If you're morally justifying what the US is doing here because you don't like Maduro, you are also morally justifying any other kind of imperialism around the world. It's just super dangerous. You're breaking the rules of law. Again, I don't like homeless people. I want to stop homeless people from starving to death. But smashing down shops and nicking their food to give to the homeless people is a way of bringing about the destruction of the international rules-based order, or the local domestic rules-based order, right? So just be careful. Moral justification, legal justification, two different things. And, you know, doing one for the purpose of one can destroy the other, and destroying the other is actually arguably far more serious. So yeah, you can give the Venezuelan people a better future going forward. And that's a big if, by the way. That's a really big if, because we don't know what's going to happen from now on. It could be chaos and it could be worse for them. Who knows? But you could give the Venezuelan people a better future, but the people of the world, like far more people, a worse future, because you now justify breaking international law. So do you care about international law or not? That's the question. But all good conversations to be having. And the problem is, you know, Trump believes that there will be no consequences following his action. Look, I'm going to do the last two here, and then I'm going to let you get on with it. Ned Langman says, Happy New Year, your national treasure, JP. This year, we will see the final downfall of Trump. Who knows, mate? Who knows? But it is already, 2026 is already shaping up to be an insane year. And I was hoping for a nice lie-in today. It didn't quite happen. Third quarter, says Goose Springsteen, but despite it being third question, but despite it being a disaster in hindsight, do you think Libya in 2011 was more justifiable? It feels like most recent interventions mix humanitarian need and economic natural resources. They do. I said this before, that there is, you know, go and look at Smedley Butler's quote that I often give you from his 19, I forget what book, was it 1930 book? When he said, you know, I was in the American Armed Forces and I went around the world basically working on behalf of a protection racket. So we went into the Bahamas because of sugar, here because of oil, here because of wherever. And that is what our armed forces do. They protect our national interests, where our national interests are invariably economic interests. And so when our armed forces work around the world to keep the Suez Canal open and to stop Somali pirates from attacking tankers, that's because we want to keep the economic interests of our country intact. And so, you know, why didn't we go into Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe was in charge? Because it had no natural resources, and there was not an economic benefit for us. So, and this goes back to kind of Kathy's guess and what Jason Hawke was also saying to a degree, or Kathy's guess to a degree, which is that if you advocate activity like that with every illegitimate government, then why don't we see it with every illegitimate government? So, for example, Robert Mugabe, terrible regime. Or what about Saudi Arabia? You know, and human rights violations taking place there. There are all sorts of illegitimate governments that what we see as illegitimate governments around the world, because they're a monarchy or they're a dictatorship. They're not our form of democracy, or they have governments that we don't like. Yeah, but if we start just attacking them all, then there's just going to be war all round. So why didn't we go and attack Robert Mugabe and his regime in Zimbabwe? Because Zimbabwe did not have what we wanted. Why did we go into Libya and Iraq and Venezuela? Because those places have what we, or the United States, wanted, which was oil, natural resources. And so you'll find that most times we depose nations, it's you know, we do, because there's an alignment of like political utility and economic utility. But the economic utility, the political utility is contingent upon economic utility. In other words, if you are minus economic utility, you don't see anyone invading countries. In other words, the real reason we invade countries is for economic utility, imperialism, natural resources, and that's why the US has gone into Venezuela. Otherwise, you can justify them going into any other country, but they haven't gone into those countries. So therefore, as much as you say this will improve the lot of Venezuelans, this is about the US making money out of oil, and it is as simple as that. And that's how I see it. So thank you very much to all of you who have supported this live stream. It's been a bit longer than I was expecting it to be, but thank you for being here. I'll try and keep ahead of the news here, but I'm also trying to do my usual Ukraine war stuff and everything else. So crazy times. Can people stop doing stuff around the world? Stop doing crazy stuff. Stop invading places. Please, please, please. I was hoping 2026 would be a bit less invadey, but it turns out that Donald Trump isn't so interested in the Nobel Peace Prize anymore. Sorry, and just one last thing. This is really interesting. Saudi Arabia, humanitarian reasons to attack, resources to attack, but actually politically okay. So interestingly, and this is where illegitimate governments, or these guys are politically suck from a Saudi Arabian point of view, you can argue, but from a US point of view or UK point of view, the Saudi Arabians buy lots of weapons off us. BAE Systems does very well, thank you very much, out of Saudi Arabia. And so politically, yeah, we don't want to unseat them because actually we can influence them in the Middle East and blah, blah, blah. So things get very, very complicated. With Venezuela, we felt, or the Americans felt, they were unable to influence them. They were not on side. They were supporting all sorts of other nefarious regimes. Plus, you had the resources there. Plus, I guess you can argue there might be some humanitarian reasons to attack Venezuela as well. So all of those aligned. Go and get them. And that's that. Okay, look, thank you very much, everybody. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.